Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, Lecture 19, Defending the Republic, specifically the War of 1812. Now, before I begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline so you can follow along, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect the terms to each other and to their larger historical significance. Now with that, now that you've got that, let's get started. Now, I want to set up a couple of things for the next few weeks of this class and the next few lectures, basically. So let's just take a moment, set this all up. So the early 19th century, again, this is kind of post-1810 period, post-War of 1812 period, that we're going to talk about in a minute. It's a time of tremendous change in America. Let me give you an example. Our seventh president, who will be Andrew Jackson, he will travel to deliver his inaugural address in 1829 in a horse-drawn carriage. 8 years later, he will leave the White House in a train. And it's just a small thing, but highlighting tremendous technological transportation advances during this period. Again, that was a period of 8 years. But between 1810, 1812, and 1840, we're going to experience some tremendous changes. The U.S. is going to witness a technological revolution, a communication revolution, an industrial revolution that will slowly change the pace and nature of our life in our new nation. We will see our political system similarly transformed into a fashion that will both fascinate and terrify Americans. The Federalist Party that we talked about thus far is going to be in demise. It's going to just fade away into oblivion. But it'll start a one-party domination that we already started talking about. But this one-party domination will give way to the formation of a second American party system. These new parties, the Democrats they'll be called, and the Whigs, will rise to prominence, as did a new style of democratic-style politics. So not only the parties themselves change, but the way in which we do politics in our country changes drastically. And of course, there's also Indian problems during this time. Specifically in this case, we already just talked about the ones in the Indiana Territory, but during this period, we'll see a new push against Native Americans, specifically in the Georgia region with the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Chickasaws. Oh, and then of course, there's the whole birth of the Cotton Kingdom of the South. Again, this is set up the future here. This is massive change. And this is going to be very disconcerting, very exciting, very scary, very tantalizing to many, both observers and Americans themselves. But we're going to start here today with politics, again, circa 1808. So when we left off last time, we talked about the Louisiana Purchase, focusing specifically on Louisiana. So what was going on in the southwest of our nation? Then we went to the northwest, talk about what was going on in the Indiana Territory with Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet, and of course the Tippecanoe. Let's go back to the east and talk about the political climate back in Washington, D.C. And so when we last talked about politics, we talked about the emergence of that first party system. In other words, this idea of loyal opposition, the formation of two opposing, clashing ideologies. You had the Federalist Party and, of course, the new Democratic Republican Party that would have this crash and clash of ideologies. And ultimately in 1800, obviously, we talked about the fact that the Revolution of 1800, the Jeffersonian Americans, birthed. And Jefferson's going to serve as 2 terms. And what we do see here is a period in which the Democratic Republicans rise to prominence and the Federalist Party, well, falls to obscurity. Ultimately, what is the final blow to the Federalist Party is the War of 1812, something we'll talk about in a minute. But at the same time, while the War of 1812 is going to destroy the Federalist Party, it's also going to show and highlight some of those limits of the small government vision of the Democratic Republicans. So that's what I want you to pay attention to today. What are the legacies of the War of 1812? What does the War of 1812 highlight? So let me explain. In 1804, Jefferson is easily reelected to become the second-term president. In 1808, he will handpick his successor, James Madison, who has served him well. And then they will, between Jefferson and Madison, they will do their very best to roll back as much as possible the Federalist administrations that had preceded them. Remember, there's two very opposing viewpoints here. There's the Federalist Party with a big government that they should expand the role and power of the federal government and centralize things, versus the Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonians, who are going to ultimately win out after 1800. They believe in agrarian America. Decentralize power, put power at the state level, and shrink government. The problem they have is, despite all this talk, despite all this animosity and butting of heads between the two parties, the reality is the federal government wasn't that big. It wasn't. The federal government, not counting postal clerks, was only about 1,000 people. But Jefferson, despite the huge land expansion, he would cut the size of the diplomatic corps. In addition, they will reduce the U.S. Army down to just 2 infantry regiments and 1 artillery regiment. This is a small army. So who's going to defend our nation now? Well, of course, it's going to be militias, state militias, local militias. And Jefferson believes in local power. Again, this reflects those revolutionary values that people like Jefferson and Madison carry. And so he cuts the government back as much as possible, shrinks it even more than it already was small. He cuts back the U.S. Army down to 2 military regiments and 1 armament, or cuts down to 2 infantry regiments and 1 artillery regiment. Very, very small, to rely on militias to defend ourselves. Well, this goes well for Jefferson in the first part of the Madison presidency. But 1810 represents a turning point for the Jeffersonians. Because in 1810, there's a new round of political elections. But in 1810, there was a midterm election. And this is a congressional election, not for president. Madison's still there, no big deal. But what is different here is many of these new politicians, there's a bunch of a younger group of politicians, younger men, who are going to be elected in the 1810. And in the 1810 midterm, this new type of politician begins to emerge. Now, what makes them different? Well, they're younger, but that's not necessarily what makes them special in and of itself. What is unique about them is they don't carry the baggage of the American Revolution. You see, people like Jefferson, Madison, even Washington and Adams, Hamilton, these guys were all alive prior to the Revolution. They all remember what life was like under Great Britain or King George. They know what they fought for. They know what life was like before. They know the transition period. They know what life was like after. But this group of politicians that started being elected in 1810, they didn't have to worry about how things used to be under Great Britain. They were never British. Or if they were too young to remember it. They were simply just American. And it's a weird thing, but they can study. They can mentally assent to the idea that, oh yeah, we were once a person that was bad. Yeah, we understand that. But if you don't live through some things in life, you really can't understand it. Case in point, in 2020 right now, we're dealing with the quarantine for the coronavirus. This is not the first time this has happened in our history. The Spanish flu outbreak of 1918 was very, very similar. And if you go back and study the history of it, many of the same rules apply. But no one who's alive now remembers that. And so therefore, there's no basis. So yeah, we understand it was bad. There was a pandemic outbreak and millions died. In fact, Spanish flu, 50 million people died. There was talks of quarantine. There was talks of social distancing. There were talks of flattening the curve. All those words were available back in 1918. The same thing with like having kids. I understood kids will change my life. I have mental assent to understand, oh man, it's going to be a big change and my time is not my own. I understood all that. But you really don't understand until you actually have the children. Well, it's the same thing for these men who get elected in 1810. They don't have a clue what life was like with Great Britain. All they know is what is current, what is American. They're proud to be American. In addition, what makes them different is many of them are coming from these new states in the West, places like Tennessee, Kentucky, states that didn't exist in the original 13 colonies. And what we find is these guys are extremely patriotic. They want to make America great. And they want to defend the United States no matter how they can do it. They are eager to prove themselves loyal and to, well, make America even greater. Now, a couple of these men, two prominent of these men in 1810, were the men on the screen right here. You see Henry Clay, Kentucky, and John C. Calhoun, South Carolina. Now, these men became known as what's called Warhawks. Why? Because these guys, they don't worry about the past. Like, they don't understand that maybe we could have lost the revolution. They just know the glory that we beat the mighty British. And so up until this point, people like James Madison are like, no, the whole French Revolution thing, we're going to stay out of this issue. We don't want no part of this issue because we know what happens in war. People die. These guys were young, not because you see there, but these guys were young in 1810. They don't remember what life was like in times of war. And so up to this point, the United States has been trying to avoid conflict. But it's becoming more and more difficult by 1810, 1812. And so there's a number of things to remember. This is the French Revolutions have been going on since 1790s. Napoleon has been spreading across Europe at this point, his great expansion. And there is some major issues of battle between Napoleon and Great Britain in 1810, 1811, 1812. And so for a number of reasons, because of this conflict, we get drawn into it despite our desire to stay out of this war. Now remember, it's across the ocean. We want no part of this war going on over in Europe. The issue is we trade with both France and Great Britain. And during 1810, 1811, 1812, the British Navy had been blockading France to prevent supplies getting to Napoleon in France. Because again, France and Great Britain are at war again. And both Jefferson and Madison basically sought peaceful solutions to, again, stay out of this war, but yet still allow us to trade with both sides. Again, we're neutral. These Warhawks, however, these two men, among others, they find this unacceptable. They believe that we have too much British influence in our country still. In fact, they believe, rightfully, that the British are the ones who are responsible for all the Indian unrest in the West, which we talked about already. They were. Not the only reason, obviously, but they're a big reason. And of course, so they come to power in 1810, and they immediately begin to agitate, to push Madison to declare war on Great Britain. Why? Well, they make a list of reasons. They're tired of British trade restrictions. Remember, we're supposed to be trading with both sides here. We're neutral. The bigger issue, though, was what was happening is the British, in their naval blockade of France, were actually boarding our ships, and they were doing what was called impressment. They were forcing our sailors to fight in the British Navy. That's a big deal. It's dealing with our and demeaning our national sovereignty. And of course, number 3 on the list, you see British support of Native American tribes out west. There's this disrespect in the high seas because they're basically saying our neutrality didn't matter. And there was some talk that, hey, maybe we want to expand a little more here. We already got, Louisiana Purchase. Let's go into Canada and get rid of the British altogether. So we have these 6 major reasons here. I'm sorry, these 5 major reasons here. Sorry. And ultimately, the Warhawks went out. And again, there's some valid reasons here. Especially, now maybe you don't talk about annexing Canada, but the support of Native American tribe, that's a big deal. Especially someone like Henry Clay in Kentucky, who's dealing with Indian troubles. The trade restriction is a big deal, but the impressment of U.S. merchant sailors is a huge blow to our national sovereignty and something these Warhawks refuse to take lightly and negotiate on. And so sure enough, in 1812, Madison will declare war on the British, essentially for these 5 main reasons. Now, the War of 1812 ultimately is going to divide the American people. People who lived along the coast, particularly in New England. If you were one of those in New England, you didn't support this war. Why? Because you're a merchant. You have most likely have very strong commercial ties to Great Britain. And basically, this is going to massively hurt your bottom line because you're going to war with the nation you trade most with. Now, if you're a person out west, though, this is a good deal. Because out west, they support the war. They thought the war would be a good way to expand, a good way to improve America's prestige. Now, big surprise, they also break down my political party. For the most part, despite wanting to stay out of things, small government, the Jeffersonians were okay with this, and they had their big base among farming in the West and South. New England was the home of the Federalist Party. They were the friends of bankers, and of course, they're the ones who hate this war, so it breaks down very politically as well as economically. Unfortunately, though, the United States, in part thanks to Jeffersonian vision and the Democratic Republican platform of smaller government, we were not prepared to prosecute a war. Like Jefferson, Madison assumed that basically, here's the easy way to do this. The state militias would push into Canada, quickly take the British out of Canada, and the British would surrender. Yay! So go take Canada with the state militias and negotiations will follow. Fantastic, we win. Game over. Unfortunately, our regular army in 1812 only had 12,000 men. Now, Congress did authorize the expansion of the army to 35,000, but service was only voluntary. It was very unpopular. It offered poor pay. There were very few trained or experienced officers to lead the men into battle, at least initially. So who wants to sign up for the war? This is an unpopular war, divided the country, both economically and politically. There's no draft, so if you want to fight for the country, it's volunteer only. You'll have poor clothing, poor shelter, poor pay, and poor leadership to lead you into battle. Any takers? Anyone? No patriots here? Instead, we have to rely on the militias, who do a pretty darn good job when they fight for their home states. But they object to serving outside of their states. They're not open to military discipline. And they will perform extremely poorly against the British regulars, especially when they're outside their home states. Home turf, home field advantage. And thus, when the War of 1812 begins, Americans are going to have a lot of problems. Now, on the one hand, we will have some success in one area, fighting Native Americans. When it comes to fighting Native Americans, we're good at that. We're good at killing Native Americans and Indians. The British, however, another story. Let's start with Native Americans. So let's go back to the Great Lakes region, right? We talked about them in the last lecture about Tecumseh the Prophet. Well, this is where we focus the first part of our attention during the war, because Tecumseh wants revenge. And in 1812, Tecumseh is going to lead Indians with British support and going to take Detroit, Fort Detroit. You see on the map there, they surrender in August of 1812. So there's initial success by the Indians and, well, the allies of the British there. However, by October 1813, we focus much of our attention, our military attention, to the Indians in the Great Lakes region, was back then the Northwest. And again, led by William Henry Harrison. The Americans are going to fight against the British-Indian alliance at the Battle of Thames. You see it there on the map, just to the north of Detroit. And in this battle, Tecumseh is fatally wounded and killed October 1813. And when he's killed, Indians scatter. They've lost their military leader. So they lost their spiritual head at the Tippecanoe, thanks to the prophet, and now they lost their military leader. And so largely after Tecumseh's death, the Northwest, the Great Lakes region, is pacified. In large part, the hero here, of course, is William Henry Harrison. In the Northeast, life is not going well for the Americans. There was an ill-fated invasion of Canada. And by that point, by 1814, everyone is questioning, why are we in this war? Why at all are we in this war? And even worse, in 1814, we've already failed invading Canada. And by 1814, there was a peace agreement between Great Britain and France, which means that naval blockade that caused the impressment of sailors. I'll go back to my list here for you. Let's see. So Native American surprise. So number one, British trade restrictions. Well, that's no longer an issue now because of the peace treaty. Impressment of sailors. That's no longer an issue because of the peace treaty. Support of Native American tribes. Well, that's still somewhat of a problem, but we won that battle. We killed Tecumseh, so that's taken care of for now. Disrespecting the high seas. Well, that's also taken care of now. So the four major issues with the British are all taken care of by 1814, yet we're still fighting this war. Now, this fifth one, annexing Canada, okay, that's there, but we failed at that already. So no harm, no foul, just give in? Maybe, maybe not. Instead, because Napoleon's armies have been defeated, there's a peace treaty, but this is bad for Americans. See, in one respect, this should have ended our war because, well, this was a reason for fighting the war, theoretically. At least Warhawks wanted to expand more land. What made it worse, though, is with the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, Britain can now turn their full attention to the United States. And we will fight what some historians call the Second War for Independence. We are fighting the British again. Remember, if we lose here, there goes the democratic experiment. And so, after Napoleon has been defeated, British turns their full attention to the United States, and the British forces are going to land in the Chesapeake Bay and move to the U.S. Capitol and burn the White House to the ground on August 24th, 1814. They will also burn the Capitol building and a number of other buildings in Washington, D.C., but specifically the White House. And of course, very famously, Dolly Madison, the wife of James Madison, will save a portrait of George Washington that is still in the White House to the present day. But wait, hold on. Did I just say that right? The White House has been burned to the ground by the British. Our capital has been captured. So we did pretty well in the Northwest, defeating Indians, but we failed invading Canada when British attention was diverted. Now that their attention's on us, we once again got our butts kicked, and our capital, our nation's capital, is burning to the ground. So in the East, things are not going well. There is one other place this battle takes place, that's the West or the Southwest. And the reason things go well there, because once again, who are we fighting mainly? Native Americans. And so William Henry Harrison was the hero in the Northwest fighting Indians. In the Southwest, the hero will be Andrew Jackson. General Andrew Jackson, a military commander out of the state of Tennessee. Again, one of those new states out west. He has how to put it mildly, a tremendous disdain and hatred for Native Americans. Basically, he wants to kill as many Native Americans as possible. He just hates them. And he spends a lifetime attacking Native Americans and will build his military reputation on the backs of killing, well, Native Americans. And he will become incredibly famous as a result of the War of 1812 and his exploits against Native Americans. So he starts in Tennessee. You see the map there. He starts in Tennessee, and he starts heading south, trying to cut his way down to New Orleans. And they finally meet this huge group of Indians known as the Creek Indians. They meet up at a battle known as Battle of Horseshoe Bend. You see why it's called Horseshoe Bend. It looks like a horseshoe. And the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, Jackson engages the Creek Indians. And in March of 1814, General Andrew Jackson crushes the Creek Indian resistance. Now, remember, this is not technically fighting for the British here. Yeah, the British support it, the British love it. They're just fighting for their lives, the Creek Indians are. And Jackson will completely annihilate the Creek Indians. The Creek Indians will suffer more than 800 casualties. This is the single highest loss for Indians in a single battle. And basically with this battle, he crushes the vast majority of Indian resistance in the South. So again, much like Harrison did in the North with the finally killing of Tecumseh, in the South, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend puts to bed Indian resistance in the South for the most part. And again, this is important because, and again, this also makes the war popular. Notice where success is at. Success is popular in the western states, Northwest, Southwest. But where it's not popular, New England, we also have some of our worst success or least success against the British. And so again, to repeat, Westerners supported the war, New Englanders did not. Largely it was political, it was economic, it was military. But those in the Northeast began to try to do something about this. And so these New Englanders with strong business ties to the British, who all they wanted to do is end this war and go back to making money, in December 1814, specifically December 15th, 1814, 5 states of New England, so Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, Connecticut, they decide to get together at a place known as the Hartford Convention, so Hartford, Connecticut. And they gather together for what's known as the Hartford Convention. And they begin to air and talk about their grievances and frustrations with the Democratic Republicans, Madison specifically. And of course, this includes things like Jeffersonian vision, the Louisiana Purchase that they feel basically does not help them at all. What benefit does it help New England to buy all this land out west? And they also want ways to improve their role in the government, expand their role. So number one, grievances against the Madison administration, including Jefferson. They want to impress or improve their role in government, their power. They want to figure out how to limit the South's power because they figure that the South has too much power thanks to the population of counting 3/5 of African American slaves as a person, as representation purposes. And so they want to protect their own rights. These are fairly small states. And so they feel that places like Virginia have way too much power, in large part because of that 3/5 compromise. So they begin to talk about something that should sound familiar. We talked about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, right? Remember Jefferson penned that Kentucky and Virginia resolution said, hey, if a state feels that a law is unconstitutional, they shouldn't follow it. Well, they said, well, the federal government is not meeting your needs. So the Hartford Convention changed it slightly, but same idea, same principle. If the federal government is ignoring your needs, maybe you can ignore the federal government. Sound familiar? Only in reverse this time. And there's even some small talk of secession, but that was largely tabled by the chairman. So again, there was a small talk of secession, but that doesn't get very far. So don't harp on that idea in any essay. The problem with this is, again, are these very real frustrations? Yes, these are. Are they legitimate concerns? Yes. Is some of it just bad apples and just complaining? Of course it is. They lost the elections. But the biggest issue here is what's called bad timing. Because these guys meet in December 15th, 1814. At the same time, Madison had peace negotiators discussing a peace treaty with the British to end the War of 1812. So despite lack of American success, somehow Madison was able to enter into peace negotiations with the British. Now, the reason for this, of course, is the British have been fighting for more than a decade against the French. They were tired of warfare. They just really wanted to end the battle. They wanted to get this all over with, just end the war. Just go back to normal. But at the same time, think about this for a minute now. You have 5 of your states who are actively talking about frustrations and grievances, ignoring the federal government at a time when you're trying to negotiate your best possible deal with a foreign power. And to give you an understanding of how intense these negotiations were, December 15th was the Hartford Convention. December 24th, just 9 days later, is when the Treaty of Ghent is signed that ends the War of 1812. And so this is incredibly bad timing that make the people at the Hartford Convention, these 5 states in New England, look incredibly unpatriotic. Again, a big turn from when they were the patriots before the Revolution. But we'll come back to these New England states in a minute. So the Treaty of Ghent is signed on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1814. It ends the war. But remember, this is not the age of a telephone, telegraph, instant messaging, texting. And it takes several weeks for that, declaration of, hey, we have peace, to go back across the Atlantic Ocean, reach the United States, and then travel all the way to the West. Again, we don't have mass transportation yet. Not yet. That's coming. And so, while New Englanders are talking about possible treasonous activity here, secession, during a war, in negotiations, Andrew Jackson is continuing to make his way through the South. And he leaves Horseshoe Bend, continues down south to make his way to New Orleans, because he figures that if the British land, that's where they're going to land at. This is the big port. Take the big, important port city. And so by 1814, by December, Jackson is encamped and been setting up and preparing to defend the city of New Orleans. And while he's getting set up in New Orleans, the members of the Hartford Convention are talking about possible treason. At the same time, of course, the negotiators are negotiating for peace, which will be signed, Treaty of Ghent, Christmas Eve, 1814. The war is over, but the message does not get to Andrew Jackson in New Orleans very quickly. It takes weeks to get back. So no one, British or American, really know this war is over, when in early January 1815, we have one more battle. Remember, the Battle of New Orleans, January 1814, 2 weeks after the war is over, but no one knows it yet. So there's this huge battle, a very important battle in our history, that's technically irrelevant in the sense that it meant nothing in the grand scheme of the war. But in this battle, no one knows it's over, British or American, and Andrew Jackson, vastly outnumbered. I mean, Jackson's got 4,000 men, the British have about 6,000 men. And we don't have exact numbers, depending on who you believe and which source is credible. But the largest number of casualties, if you go to the largest number you can find in the historical sources, Americans suffered at maximum 700 casualties out of a total of 4,000 troops. That's impressive. The British, again, taking the worst or the largest number, the worst possible outcome, they suffered up to 2,000 casualties, a third of their troops. Let me repeat that. Jackson suffered at worst 70 casualties out of 4,000 troops. The British suffered at worst 2,000 casualties out of 6,000 troops, a third of their troops. This is one of the most lopsided victories for the United States. The war is over, but no one knows it. And so over the next couple of weeks, the newspapers in the United States began publicizing these headlines saying, Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, hero, defeats the British, kicks their butts, only loses 70 men. And then below all that is a small headline, Treaty of Ghent signed. Now, these were good reporters. They did say, January 1815, Battle of New Orleans, and then Treaty of Ghent, December 1814. But like many of you who don't like reading all the details, neither did most Americans back in the 1815s. And as a result, when people saw the huge headlines on top that say, Andrew Jackson, hero, kicked the British's butt, down below that, war ends, Treaty of Ghent. So why did the British give in and negotiate? Who's the person that really ended this war? So popular opinion around the country is, of course, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, again, he's a hero for the Battle of New Orleans. Don't get me wrong. That's all well and true. But it was an irrelevant battle after the war had already ended. But in the minds of most Americans, he was the one responsible for ending the War of 1812 due to the way the newspapers ran the headlines. And he'll be elevated to the national spotlight. Now, ultimately, let's talk about these outcomes here for a minute, because the War of 1812 ends. I guess this is often a forgotten war, this so-called Second War for Independence. Let's talk about 5 key outcomes of this War of 1812. Number 1, it set the stage for Canadian identity. In other words, Canadians during this war actually began to fight for themselves rather than for their British, colonizers. And so while it won't happen immediately, the War of 1812 will be for the Canadians, for Canadian identity, much like the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, was for the United States. It set the path for so the 7 Years' War set a unique path for American identity, American, cultural identity. The War of 1812 did the same similar thing for Canadian identity. So number 1, helped set the path for Canadian identity. But for the U.S. part, this dealt a huge blow to the Native Americans. Once again, the big loser here was Native Americans. They got their butts kicked by Harrison in the Northwest, Great Lakes region, and by Jackson in the Southwest. And of course, we're going to talk about he'll be a future president, thus bad things are going to happen. In fact, we have a project about that. So, big losers, Native Americans. Number 3, the Federalist Party is completely discredited. They are seen as insufferable, selfish, unpatriotic losers as a result of the Hartford Convention. And ultimately, they are discredited. This is the end of the political party. And basically, it signals out the decade now of political infighting. We now have one political party system at this point. And it begins what's called the quote-unquote era of good feelings as a result. So number 3, Federalist Party's gone. We're down to a one-party system. Number 4, Congressman Henry Clay, one of the Warhawks, he begins to sound the alarm that said, yeah, that War of 1812 has some stark revelations, revealed some big cracks in our American nation. Number 1, we have a weak infrastructure. Like, how do you send troops and supplies across our country? We have a weak infrastructure. We need roads. We need something to transport. He says we have a feeble financial institution that couldn't even afford to pay respectable wages to our military. We need to shore up our financial situation. So, infrastructure, finances. And of course, this terrifies many of these politicians because they were proud to be Americans, but they were terrified because they said, we came this close to losing to the British, and that can't happen again. And so what we see as a result of Henry Clay sounding this alarm is that many of these one-party system Democratic Republicans, Jeffersonians, begin to depart from that Jeffersonian vision almost immediately, advocating that, you know what, there are limits to the Jeffersonian vision. We need a more robust government in some respect. Not saying huge government, not the Federalist level of government, but we need to expand things a little bit. And then the last one you see on the left of your screen Andrew Jackson is a rising star. Even though the Battle of New Orleans was irrelevant, it was important for two major reasons. Number one, it restored American faith in our country, our military. It was a big, major battle. It made us feel good. Remember, we were kind of losing this war. Remember, our White House was burned. The Battle of New Orleans restored some pride in America. And the man responsible for that was Andrew Jackson, who was now a rising political star. The Battle of New Orleans made him famous. And he will become an up-and-coming politician who is going to really shake things up in our country, politically speaking, and economically as well. But we'll talk about that in the future lectures. But for now, just know the War of 1812, a forgotten war, was incredibly important. And it does start to change the way we look at politics, economics, and finances in our country. And will lead a new politician hero, Andrew Jackson. But we'll talk about them all next time. But until next time, take care and bye-bye.